So Lainey Cannon last year at 2019 Summit introduced us all to this idea of a digital scavenger hunt. It was fantastic. It's an engaging, free way to really reinforce key behaviors and policies to your workforce. So we decided to pump up the volume this year. So our team stood up to the challenge, led by Neaka, who's about to speak about it, and actually she led, and her team, a digital global scavenger hunt. So she's going to share with you the details about the scavenger hunt, how she and her team did it, and how you can do it for October. And what's fantastic is if you did not participate in it, it's closed. That means you can't get a prize. Neaka's found that there's winners. She'll talk about how we'll be announcing them today. But Neaka, if you could in your talk, let people know if they did not go through the scavenger hunt, if they can still go through it, even though they can't win a prize. So folks, Neaka and digital scavenger hunts. Woo-woo!
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction, Lance. So for those of you who I have not had the chance to meet, my name is Neaka Balloge. I work for NYU Langone Health. We're a large healthcare system in the Metro NYC area. We have 5 hospitals, over 300 ambulatory locations, and a little over 40,000 full-time staff. So like many of you, I am a lone ranger. I am a team of one. And in that current role at NYU Langone, I manage all of our cybersecurity awareness initiatives, our trainings, our communications, as well as development of our IT standards and policies. But enough about me. Let's get on to the scavenger hunt. So first of all, to kick things off, thank you all so much for those of you who took the time to play and participate. We have received some really fantastic feedback, and we really hope that today's presentation is going to empower you all to go back to your organizations and try and replicate this activity, whether it's for October for National Cybersecurity Awareness Month or any other time that you want an event in your organization. So let's get started. So similar to Paige's talk, we have structured this into 3 phases. So as any of you that have ever worked on a project know, these phases are not necessarily discrete. They may not even be linear. You may see that as you perform some testing, you may go back and forth between these phases. You may have to go back, reconsider some options that you've made. But nonetheless, for the purposes of today's presentation, we've structured this across 3 phases just to help guide your thinking when you're trying to duplicate this in your own companies. So the phases that we're going to walk through here today: Phase 1, key decisions and customization options. Phase 2, clue creation. And then lastly, Phase 3, which is putting it all together. So Phase 1. So this is really all about thinking through various aspects of the scavenger hunt and thinking about what types of technologies you have available to you within your organization. So for each decision that we have listed here, I'm going to share a slide where I'm going to tell you how we did it. I'm going to give you some of the rationale behind why we did it that way. And then I'm going to give you some alternative options. And so these will be some options that you might be able to utilize depending on any enterprise tools that you have available, or depending on any types of restrictions that you may have within your organization. So let's take a quick look at these decisions we're going to cover. So first, how will you distribute clues to players? How will you receive responses from players? How will you offer help or guidance to your players? And then lastly, how will you determine or recognize your winners? So let's look at that first decision. So our first decision, how will you distribute clues to players? How are you even going to get all of these wonderful resources to the people that you want to go through them? So first, how we did it, our focus here was on utilizing free tools. So for the purposes of this hunt, we wanted this to be something that a team that has $0 of a budget would be able to replicate within their organization. And we also wanted something that was widely accessible. So when we put the clues out there, we wanted it to be easily accessed by the people who were playing. We didn't want to have to go through a separate registration process and then communicate those clues just to a small population. We wanted to have that as widely available so that we could share that link in as many places as possible. So that led us to use Google Web Pages and Google Web Forms to achieve that. And I'll show you an example actually of how that looks on the next slide. But if we want to talk about some alternative options, so one that we heard from some folks who had Google blocked or Google tools blocked within their enterprise, if you happen to be a Microsoft shop instead, Microsoft Office 365, they have great functionality that you can duplicate this with their Microsoft Forms. And then there's also some other tools that you may use in your enterprise. So Slack, if you use Slack like we're using today, Yammer, a SharePoint community, or even a company intranet. So if you already have any of these existing channels that you deliver messaging to your employees, you can leverage these channels as well to be able to put your clues out to the public. So here is the exact example of how we did that. So you can see with our Google Sites, we used a custom vanity URL that we created. It's very tiny there. You can see Scavenger Hunt Start. So this was an easy URL that we were able to blast out to everyone so that they could just click and play. And then you see we have the integration here with a Google web page, and then we have a Google form. And I'm going to cover that on our next decision, but you can see this was pretty seamless. And as people visited this web page, they were able to read the instructions and they were able to scroll down and get started right away with that form looking at the clues. So as I just mentioned, we're talking about how you receive the responses. So when we actually put those clues out there, how are we going to get answers back from our players? So for this decision, our focus really was on 4 things. So over here on the left, so focus on scalability. So scalability in this sense, we had no idea what type of participation we were going to have. We didn't know if we would have dozens of players, hundreds of players, thousands of players. In the end, we ended up having almost 500, which was fantastic just for the short week that we ran it. But nonetheless, we wanted something that would allow for some type of automation. So when folks actually submitted their responses, we wanted that to be captured automatically. We really were hesitant to do anything that would involve us having to do one-on-one feedback with every single submission that we received. So our first focus there, scalability, making sure that we can manage this for a wide range of participants. Secondly, ease of analysis. So we wanted to have the ability to analyze data without having to manually import it or enter it into any other type of database. So you'll see here when I go over the Google Forms, these types of tools are fantastic because they already have that analytic capability built right in. And this allows you to easily, with one click, just export all of your responses and then filter and review those and perform any analysis that you want. But we went with this option because rather than having people send every response over a different type of channel, like a Slack channel or an email inbox, this allowed us to do that automatic analysis that really saves a lot of time later. The third thing that we focused on was privacy of responses. So what we mean by privacy of responses is that we didn't want a clue to go out and then the first person answer it and then give away the whole game for everyone. So we really wanted to make sure that any responses we received were kept private so that other players couldn't be swayed or opinionated by those answers that they're seeing. And then lastly, again, cost. We wanted this to be completely free so that people could duplicate this free of charge within their organizations. So some of the alternative options that you could use for this. So again, really trying to make sure you have that analytic capability. We would recommend something, if you already have approved survey software, something like a Qualtrics or a SurveyMonkey within your organization, that's fantastic. And that's going to save a lot of time of you manually putting responses that you receive into an Excel workbook to analyze. Slack is another option, but again, with Slack, you just have to be mindful of the privacy of those responses and make sure that you don't have anyone that's overexcited and just yells out the answer right away on a forum that can be viewed by all of your players. Another alternative option is the email inboxes. So I had done an activity similar to this on a very, very small scale last October, And I did use an existing activities inbox that I had, and it was manageable for that population. But again, take that into consideration. If you're doing this activity with only, 20, 30, 40 players, you can probably manage it like that. But anything more, you're going to probably want to steer to some of those softwares that can actually give you that analytic capability. And then here's the example of how we did it with the Google Forms. So this is one of the forms. This was the tier 2 form. And I just want to point out to you the 2 tabs right near where that arrow is pointing that say question and responses. So this is really, really helpful when you're building forms like this, using Google Forms or any type of similar product. In the questions tab, that's where you can go in, you can edit, you can manipulate all of your text. And you'll see there's a very small little bar here, a little column with some icons. It's very intuitive, very easy to use as far as adding questions, changing the type of questions, changing the entry field that respondents can populate. All of those things are very simple and very intuitive to use. But I just also want to call out that responses tab there. So that responses tab is very important because as you're going through and as you're performing your testing, that response tab allows you to both easily export that data. So you can, in Google Forms, when you click on responses, there's a small little icon of 3 dots. You click on that, there's the option to export your answers to a CSV file. So you can do that, and then you can easily manipulate and work with all of that data in Excel. So that's one great thing about the response tab. The other great thing is that you can look, as you're doing your testing, you can actually see for each question a little bar graph of the different responses that you've received and how many people have provided those responses. And so that can be really helpful because you can see right off the bat, if you have a very wide range of responses to any given clue, that should be an indicator that you need to go back and tighten up that clue, that people are not understanding where they should be looking for that answer. And the end goal with this is we do want this to be educational. We want it to be challenging, but at the end, we want it to be educational and we want people to have learned something. And if they can never get to the information that we're trying to teach them, the whole activity is rather pointless. So look at the variance of those responses. Try and drive those down so that you have people pointing just to at least the correct response and maybe just a few others if they're very confused. But additionally, if you look at your responses and if you just have 2 answers, that's another indication that you may want to go back to that clue and review that again to see if perhaps you're not leading people to the right web page, but they might not be thoroughly understanding the clue and they might be answering with another number, figure, word that's very close to what you want them to get. But they might be looking at, let's say, the graph on the left side of the screen versus the right or something like that. So again, take that feedback, go back, clean up that clue, make sure it's pointing to the exact thing that you're trying to assess knowledge about. So third decision, how are you going to offer help or guidance to your players if they get stuck or if they have questions? So our focus here was on manageability. So again, similar to the scalability issue, we wanted to make sure that we would be able to manage any types of questions, concerns that were coming in. We also wanted to try and foster collaborative learning. So whenever possible, we wanted to empower players to work with one another and try and figure out where they may have gone wrong or just discuss amongst themselves. So really, for fostering collaborative learning, we wanted to promote that type of discussion within our communities. So how we did it? So we did a 3-fold approach. So we have the Slack channel, which so many of you are engaging on today, which is fantastic. So the Slack channel was only shared with registered forum participants. We then realized that we had a population of people who probably still want to play the activity, but were not registered. So for those folks, we had an email address, and then we also made sure to create an FAQ list. And this is really just going through, thinking of all of those super common questions that people may ask, so you can get ahead of that and already have all of those responses ready to go. So some alternative options for engagement, again, Slack, like what we used, if you can replicate that, if you have community engagement there, fantastic. Yammer is another tool. SharePoint communities, if you have a community page and people can make comments back and forth, that's another great option. And then even existing email inboxes. So similar to what we leveraged for our non-registered forum participants, we were able to do an email alias very easily. And thankfully, because we were very explicit in our FAQs and our instructions, we were not bombarded with questions. So I'll show you here exactly how our help looked. So again, right here we have the FAQs. So this was critical just for all of those very simple, very commonly asked questions. We made sure all of those responses were published and already thought through. We then have the email address, the sans.org email address there at the bottom. And then we also had the Slack channel. So a lot of you are already engaging there today. But the one thing to note, if you do use something like a Slack channel or Yammer or anything like that, is you really want to just emphasize and remind players that they can discuss amongst themselves, but please don't post the answers to the clues themselves in the channel. So we have the disclaimer here that posting any of that information in the channel would automatically disqualify you from prize consideration. And then the last decision here. So how are you going to determine or recognize winners? So our focus here was on fairness. So we realized we wanted this to be an international event, and it would not be fair to award people based on the first submission or something like that if we were releasing clues that might be in the middle of the day here on the East Coast, but either might be very early in the morning for the West Coast or just in the middle of the night for the rest of the world. So we realized that's not really a fair way to run the game. Of course, you want to think about your game objective. That's very closely tied to the fairness. Is it fair to reward the first person to submit? Perhaps if you're all in the same time zone, if you're all in one office, sure, that can work, but just keep that into consideration. And then even the cost of prizes. So we wanted to go with something that would work for the limited budget that we have here. So our prizes that we're awarding today, we're going to have a winner from each tier, and we're going to be awarding them challenge coins. And then we're going to have one overall winner selected from everyone who answered all of those clues correctly. And they're going to be getting a free pass to our live in-person awareness summit that's happening in December. But just to give you a little specifics about how we chose our winners using the Google Forms. So what we did was we went into that analytics tab that I pointed out with our responses. We clicked on those three little dots. We exported the data to a CSV file. And then we just very simply, we put filters on all of the columns that had clue responses. We filtered out for just the correct clue responses. We then took that resulting list of names, put those on a separate Excel tab, and then opened Google's random number generator, put in the range of responses that we received. So let's say we had 300 correct response, number 1 through 300, hit the button, and it randomly selected a number. And then we looked at the corresponding row on our spreadsheet, and voila, we had our winners. So alternative options that you can do. Again, if you do have everyone within the same time zone, within just a few offices, you can do something like rewarding the first person to either complete the tier or the first person to find your buried treasure. But do not forget the importance of things like participation certificates. You can even do something like have an image that's at the end of the final tier that you can encourage players to download and to share on any type of company intranets or anything like that. So that can also be a way just to recognize people for playing. And just don't forget good old-fashioned recognition for your winners. So making sure that you're giving those people a shout out and that they're feeling like they're being recognized for their good work. So for this decision, I'm not going to share an exact example on the next slide of how we did that, just to protect the privacy of our players' names and their email addresses. So now moving on to phase 2. So phase 2, this really has to do with coming up with those wonderful clues to take people to all of the educational resources and websites that you want to cover. And so what we've done here is we've given you an example of how we started this. So we really started thinking broadly. We just brainstormed thinking, what are topics, and then what are resources or websites that we could point people to educate them on their topics. And one thing that we wanted to note here is, if you can, include different formats of information that you point people to. So rather than having everyone go to just a web page and read text, if you can point people to something like a YouTube clip or a podcast that they have to listen to, that's even a wonderful additional knowledge that you can pass on, and it makes it a little more interesting and exciting for the people that are playing. So now when you're actually creating those clues, so once you have your topics and a resource or a website in mind, you can then actually write a clue. So our guidance for writing clues, first of all, make sure that you preface the clue with some information. So here we have an example for Verizon DBIR. Make sure that you give a little bit of introduction on what this is or why you're taking people there, and then actually get to the meat of your question. And another guideline here is try and have those questions result in answers that are very definitive. So try and have people respond with things like a number, a single word, something like that, rather than a phrase or a free-form paragraph that they have to try and write that you would then have to try and score as whether it's accurate or not. So think about when you're analyzing this data, when you're putting filters on data, you want to have it pretty simple that you can discern what is a correct answer versus what is not your correct answer. So again, things like numbers, single words, those are the best and the simplest to be able to then grade for accuracy. And then for additional game length and complexity, you can add tiers to your clues. And so how we did this was we went back to our clues and we then tried to assess them based on level of difficulty. And so we grouped our easiest questions, tier 1, medium questions were tier 2, and then those more challenging questions that involve some deeper digging and research were our tier 3. And you can see here in the blue, that's an example of how we went through and ranked these. Both of these clues ended up going into our 3rd tier. One pointer here, and this is something that we did not have the bandwidth to do, but that you can plan for if you have time and resources. You can have the clues themselves be delivered in different modalities. So in addition to taking people to things like recordings, videos, or podcasts, you can also have that clue delivered in a video format. So something like Celebrity Jeopardy, if you would have a celebrity reading the clue out loud, perhaps you have someone like your CISO or you have some visible members of your leadership or security team, you could have them read one of your clues, and then that would just make it a little bit more interesting when your players are going through those clues to have to listen to a video recording. But a note on that, just always make sure that it is compatible with whatever type of form or tool that you're using to distribute those clues. Make sure that video works and that it can be sent to your players. So moving right along, so putting it all together. So this is really where the journey and the gamification part comes into play, and all these pieces really start to come to life. So how we did it, so again, we used that Google web page to kick off the activity, and we then distributed and posted that link on the SANS.org page and around the internet for people to start playing. We then had the Google Pages with vanity URLs to progress through each tier. So essentially what that means is that these vanity URLs, I'll show you on the next slide, were the first characters of the correct answers from the previous tier. So you had to get those answers right to get to the next tier. And then the final tier answer, we mixed in the idea of having a buried treasure. So one important note, if you do these things as far as vanity URLs and GPS coordinates, if you're using the vanity URLs, your responses to clues can guide those URLs. So you can customize those to any series of numbers, letters, characters that you wish. But if you are doing the GPS coordinates idea, you need to pick your location first and then make sure your clue responses fit those exact coordinates. So I'll show you that on the next slide here. So the vanity URLs, so you can see up here, we actually use the first character of the correct answers from that prior tier to access then tier 2 and then tier 3. So that's very simple, and you can modify those vanity URLs to whatever series of characters your clue responses end up formulating. However, if you use GPS coordinates like we did for the 3rd tier and for that very final answer, you need to work backwards, and you need to get those coordinates, and you need to make sure those coordinates point to somewhere that makes sense for your players. So for those of you who may not have realized it and who got through the hunt, our treasure was buried at the Austin Hilton, which coincidentally is the location of the in-person awareness summit that is scheduled for December. So we hid the treasure there because that's where we're hoping that we will find you all, fingers crossed, in December. But nonetheless, please make sure you're being specific with those coordinates and test. Make sure that you can see here we have circled, so the correct answer, those first series, that was what came out of our tier 3 responses, and then we gave players the second half of the coordinates. So if you really want to go above and beyond, you can have players figure out that whole string of coordinates, but just be mindful of survey fatigue and that that is a fair amount of digits for people to put together. So reminder, we cannot say enough about the importance of testing. Make sure that you leave time. When you were planning the activity, we left about a full week for beta testing. So you want to make sure that you share the web pages, you share the forms, that you have the whole thing put together and allow people to go through it and just see how are they responding, see what types of questions they come to you with, go back, make those modifications. So one thing that we learned is that everyone truly reads things and understands and interprets them differently. So you may think that it's very easy or very intuitive to find the answer on a web page that you already know. But if you ask somebody else who's never been to this web page, you need to make sure that anyone can navigate to that correct response and that you are being as specific and directive in your clues as possible. And we can't stress enough the importance of reviewing those analytics for each clue using survey tools as you're doing your testing. And again, that will help guide you on which clues you need to tweak, on which clues you may need to cut completely, or which clues you might just need to add a little bit better clarification so that people get the answers that you want. Again, this is all about education, and we want to make sure that we are guiding players to that important information that we want to stress. And of course, encourage players to crowdsource information from one another. One great thing that we learned during our testing was that when we were using Google Pages and Google Forms together, when you actually hit submit on the forms, a lot of people initially thought they were presented with a blank white screen. But a limitation we learned of that tool is that the confirmation text that we wrote saying your responses were received, thanks for playing, all of that was captured, but you needed to scroll up using your cursor to see that text. So testing, that will point out those things. And then we made sure to be very explicit in our instructions in the form that once you click submit, you need to scroll back up and you'll see confirmation that those responses were received. But again, all of this comes out of testing and being very, very thorough before you launch this to a large population. All right, so I think I got through that just about in time, but we just want to make another reminder of thanking everyone who participated. Thank you all for the fantastic feedback that we received. It was really encouraging to see so many people have a positive experience as they went through the activity. And as a final reminder, we will be announcing our winners in a few hours after lunch, after it might be a dinner break for some, but we'll be announcing our winners, and very excited to then share with you these slides. And also we can share with you the clues that we developed just as examples. We did have a few requests for those. So thank you all so much for playing. Thank you for your time, and happy hunting.